For years, Alessandro Moretti, green-haired mafia kingpin and silent ruler of the criminal underworld, believed his power came from the stillness he lived in. A man who spoke little, heard nothing, and controlled everything. But when a new maid steps into his study and discovers something buried deep inside his ear, the unthinkable happens. The man who built an empire in silence hears the world for the very first time. And with sound comes clarity. With clarity comes suspicion. And suspicion, in Sandro's world, leads straight to bloodshed. Alessandro Moretti governs his territory with absolute precision. To rivals, his silence is terror. To his crew, it is discipline. But beneath the myth lies a hidden truth. Sandro was born nearly deaf, surviving by instinct and cold observation, never by sound. Inside his luxury mansion, noise is forbidden. The staff walks softly. Voices stay low. Mistakes are not tolerated. This carefully controlled world shatters the day Elena Rossetti enters his study. Calm, focused, and impossibly brave, she notices something no doctor ever dared to mention. Leaning close, she adjusts the angle of his head, reaches toward his ear, and with a steady hand removes a hardened obstruction that had been lodged there since his childhood. In an instant, Sandro is overwhelmed. His own breath. The clock ticking. The soft rustle of Elena's clothing. The distant gasp of the elderly woman standing behind him. Sounds he never knew existed crash into him all at once. A miracle. A revelation. And a warning. Because if Elena could see what specialists ignored for decades, someone made sure Sandro lived in silence. And now that he can finally hear, the most feared man in the city understands one thing with absolute certainty. Someone close to him has been lying all his life, and he is going to find out who. Sandro sat in the high-backed leather chair of his study, the weight of the city pressing against the glass panes of the window behind him. In this room, silence wasn't just a lack of sound, it was a physical presence, heavy and deliberate. To the men who served him, Sandro's silence was more terrifying than a shouted order. It meant he was watching, weighing, and deciding. His morning routine was a ritual of precision. He began at dawn with a single cup of black espresso, the steam rising in a thin, straight line. There were no frantic phone calls or chaotic meetings. Instead, his lieutenants arrived one by one, moving like shadows across the Persian rug. They spoke in hushed tones, delivering reports on the docks, the unions, and the whispers from the rival families. Sandro never interrupted. He simply listened, his fingers tracing the edge of a silver fountain pen, his gaze fixed on a point just beyond their shoulders. His reputation was built on this terrifying stillness. In a world of loud men and explosive violence, Sandro was the anchor. He didn't need to display his power through outbursts, his power was the fact that he hadn't needed to raise his voice in over a decade. He was the silent Don, a man who could ruin a life with a single, slight nod of his head. When he finally did speak, his voice was a low rasp, sandpaper on silk, carrying a weight that made the air in the room feel thin. "The shipments are late," he remarked, the words barely more than a breath. The lieutenant across from him paled, shifting his weight. "There was a delay at the border," donned Sandro. "The weather." Sandro raised a hand, just an inch off the mahogany desk. The lieutenant fell silent instantly. The room grew colder. Sandro didn't care about the weather, he cared about the friction that slowed his machine. He looked out at the skyline, where the gray clouds of a brewing storm mirrored the mood in the room. He didn't offer a threat or a deadline. He didn't have to. The man bowed his head, understood the unspoken ultimatum, and backed out of the room as if retreating from a shrine. Left alone, Sandro took a final sip of his cooled coffee. He was a man of shadows and echoes, governing an empire from the center of a quiet web. He knew that as long as he remained still, the world around him would continue to spin exactly as he commanded. The heavy iron gates of the estate groaned open, yielding to the taxi that carried Elena into a world governed by a chilling, rhythmic order. As she stepped onto the gravel driveway, the sheer scale of the stone manor felt designed to diminish anything human. She had been warned that working for Don Sandro required more than just competence. It required the ability to become part of the architecture, unobtrusive, functional, and, above all, quiet. The housekeeper, a woman with a face like etched granite, led Elena through the vaulted corridors. Every surface gleamed with a cold, mirrored perfection. There were no family photographs on the mantels, no stray books on the side tables, and no warmth in the air despite the roaring fireplaces. The rules were laid out before she even met the master of the house: never speak unless addressed, never linger in the hallways, and never, under any circumstance, enter the study without an invitation. Elena's first encounter with Sandro happened near the tall windows of the gallery. He didn't look up as she approached. He was standing perfectly still, watching a hawk circle the distant tree-line. His presence was a vacuum, pulling the energy out of the room until only his stillness remained. When he finally turned, his eyes didn't settle on her face with curiosity or even scrutiny. They moved over her as if she were a piece of furniture being catalogued for its utility. "The girl," he said, his voice a dry rustle that barely reached her. It wasn't a question. "Elena, sir," she replied, her own voice sounding unnervingly loud in the vacuum of the hall. He didn't acknowledge the name. Instead, he looked back toward the window, his profile sharp and unyielding. There was an emotional distance in him that felt like a physical barrier, a frozen lake that ran deep and dark. He didn't offer a welcome or a list of expectations. He simply existed in a sphere of isolation that Elena realized she was meant to maintain, not penetrate. As the days turned into a week, Elena moved through the house like a ghost. She observed the way the staff pivoted around his schedule with practiced dread. Sandro's life was a series of silent, rigid movements. He ate alone, walked the grounds alone, and retreated to his study for hours, leaving a trail of silence in his wake. Elena found herself watching him from the shadows of the mezzanine, wondering if the man beneath the suit was as hollow as the house he inhabited, or if the silence was merely a dam holding back a flood she wasn't yet prepared to see. The silence of the estate began to feel less like peace and more like a held breath. Elena moved through the grand library, her soft-soled shoes barely whispering against the polished oak floors. She was tasked with dusting the first edition spines, a job that required her to be near Sandro while he worked. He sat at his desk, a monolith of focus, bathed in the pale, slanted light of the late afternoon. As she moved closer to the desk to reach a high shelf, the light shifted, hitting the side of Sandro's head at a sharp angle. He was leaning over a ledger, his silver hair neatly swept back, exposing the architecture of his jaw and the curve of his ear. Elena paused, her cloth mid-air. There was something wrong. Nestled deep within the canal of his ear was a small, flesh-colored obstruction. It wasn't a hearing aid, it was too sleek, too deliberate, and lacked the telltale gleam of medical plastic. It looked like a seal, a tiny, custom-molded plug that seemed to sit between him and the rest of the world. She froze, her heart hammering against her ribs. In a house where sound was a currency, this tiny object felt like a profound secret. Sandro didn't move, but the atmosphere in the room changed instantly. The temperature seemed to drop, the stillness sharpening into something predatory. Without lifting his head from the ledger, his eyes shifted toward her reflection in the glass of a nearby bookcase. "Is there a problem, Elena?" he asked. The rasp of his voice was lower than usual, vibrating through the quiet like a warning bell. "No, sir," she stammered, quickly turning her gaze back to the books. "Just a difficult angle." He didn't respond, but he didn't return to his reading either. He remained perfectly still, a statue of a man, allowing the silence to stretch until it became suffocating. Elena realized then that the silent Don wasn't just a master of his environment, he was actively filtering it. The obstruction wasn't to help him hear, it was to ensure he only heard what he chose. She worked with trembling hands, feeling his gaze lingering on her even after he finally looked back down. She had seen something she wasn't meant to see, a chink in the armor or perhaps the very mechanism of his power. As she eventually slipped out of the room, the image of that small, flesh-toned plug burned in her mind, a physical manifestation of the wall he had built between himself and the living, breathing world. The opportunity arrived on a Tuesday, an afternoon draped in the heavy, humid stillness that preceded a summer storm. Sandro had fallen into an uncharacteristic sleep in his leather armchair, his head tilted back against the hide. The ledger lay open on his lap, his hand still resting on the page, but his breathing had slowed into a deep, rhythmic cadence. Elena approached him with the steadiness of a surgeon. Her pulse was a drumbeat in her ears, but her hands did not shake. She had spent days obsessing over that small, flesh-colored seal, convinced it was the barrier keeping him locked in his cold, silent tower. As she leaned over him, the scent of expensive tobacco and old paper filled her senses. She could see the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the only evidence of the years he had spent behind his wall. With a pair of delicate silver tweezers she had hidden in her apron, she reached for the obstruction. It was seated deep, suctioned against the canal. She moved with agonizing slowness, mindful of the predator that slept beneath the skin. With a soft, wet click, the seal broke. She pulled the tiny, custom-molded plug free, and then, moving to the other side, repeated the motion. Sandro's eyes snapped open. The reaction was violent and immediate. He didn't jump, he recoiled, his entire body tensing as if he had been struck by a physical blow. His hands flew to his ears, his fingers clawing at the air. What? He started to speak, but his own voice seemed to terrify him. It was a roar in his head, a thundering vibration he hadn't truly felt in years. Outside, a bird chirped on the windowsill. The sound made him flinch, his gaze darting toward the glass as if a gunshot had gone off. Then came the hum of the refrigerator in the distant kitchen, the ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, sounds that were mundane to Elena were, to Sandro, an assault of pure color and light. He looked at Elena, and for the first time, the distance was gone. The icy, untouchable dawn was replaced by a man who looked raw and exposed. His chest heaved as he processed the cacophony of the world. He heard the rustle of her dress, the intake of her breath, and the low, distant rumble of thunder. The wind, he whispered, his voice trembling. He turned his head toward the window, his eyes wide and brimming with a sudden, painful clarity. I can hear the wind. The silence he had cultivated for a decade had vanished, shattered by the simple, terrifying gift of sound. He reached out, his hand hovering near Elena's arm, not to dismiss her, but as if seeking an anchor in the sudden, loud sea of his own life. The world was no longer a painting, it was a landslide. Sandro sat frozen in his chair, his fingers digging into the leather armrests until his knuckles turned a ghostly white. The mundane symphony of the estate, the rhythmic ticking of the clock, the distant hum of the ventilation, the rustle of Elena's uniform, hit him with the force of a physical assault. Each vibration was a needle pressing against his nerves. He tried to speak, but the sound of his own breath was a gale-force wind in his throat. For years, he had lived in a curated vacuum, a king in a kingdom of shadows where he controlled the volume of reality. Now, the wall had crumbled, and the flood was drowning him. He squeezed his eyes shut, but that only sharpened the auditory chaos. He could hear the blood rushing through his own veins, a dull, thudding reminder of a life he had tried to suppress. Stop it, he gasped, but the word echoed off the high ceilings like a crack of thunder. Elena took a tentative step toward him, her shoes crunching against the rug. To Sandro, it sounded like bone snapping. He flinched, pulling away from her as if she carried a flame. The emotional distance he had spent a decade perfecting was evaporating, replaced by a raw, terrifying vulnerability. He felt naked. Every secret he had buried, every scream he had ignored in his rise to power, seemed to vibrate in the air around him. The sensory overload triggered a cascade of memories he wasn't prepared to face. The sound of the wind outside the window wasn't just weather, It was the ghost of a night long ago, the whistle of a train, the shout of a man he had betrayed. The silence had been his shield, a way to keep the ghosts at bay. Without it, the guilt he had cauterized was bleeding through. He looked up at Elena, his face contorted in a mask of agony and wonder. A single tear tracked through the dust on his cheek, a sight that would have signaled the end of his empire had any of his men been there to see it. He was no longer the Don, he was a man caught in a storm of his own making. Too much, he wheezed, his hands shaking as he covered his ears, trying in vain to find the quiet place again. It is all, too much. The house, once his fortress of solitude, had become a chamber of echoes, and Sandro was finally, painfully, awake within it. Sandro remained huddled in the chair, his hands slowly lowering from his ears, though his fingers stayed curled as if ready to shield himself at a moment's notice. The initial shock had subsided into a shimmering, high-tension clarity. He looked at Elena, and for the first time in his life, he didn't see a servant or a variable to be managed. He saw the soft rise and fall of her chest and heard the delicate, rhythmic friction of her breathing. It was a miracle, a symphony of the living that he had denied himself for an eternity. A profound sense of gratitude washed over him, thick and suffocating. He wanted to thank her, to reach out and acknowledge the woman who had dared to break his glass coffin. The world possessed a texture he had forgotten. The chime of a distant bird was not just a sound, but a silver thread stitching him back into the tapestry of existence. He felt, for a fleeting second, the lightness of a man reborn. But then, the weight of the past began to settle into the new frequency. If he could hear the wind, he could also hear the memories. He looked at his hands, the hands of the silent dawn, and realized the true cost of his decade of stillness. How many pleas for mercy had he missed because he chose the seal? How many warnings had been whispered that he had deliberately tuned out? The silence hadn't just been a physical choice, it had been an emotional anesthesia. By deafening himself to the world, he had deafened himself to his own conscience. Fear, cold and jagged, began to coil around his heart, competing with the awe. To hear meant to be responsible. To hear meant he could no longer pretend that his orders were carried out in a vacuum. He thought of his men downstairs, their voices currently muffled by the heavy doors, and felt a sudden, sharp pang of dread. If they knew he could hear, the mystique of the silent dawn would shatter. His power was built on the terrifying unknown of his inner thoughts. If he was now a man who could be reached, he was a man who could be hurt. He looked at the two small, flesh-colored plugs resting on the mahogany desk like discarded husks. They represented safety, a return to the numb, predictable shadows where he was a god. But as he listened to the rain beginning to tap against the glass, a sound as intricate and beautiful as 1,000 tiny heartbeats, he realized he was caught between two deaths. To put them back was to die in the dark. To leave them out was to live in a world that might finally demand an account for everything he had done while he wasn't listening. The silver telephone on Sandro's desk sat like a dormant beast, its potential energy suddenly amplified by his newfound vulnerability. For years, the device had been a mere prop. His lieutenants would answer, transcribe the words into sterile notes, and present them for his silent deliberation. Now, the ringer erupted with a shrill, piercing clarity that made Sandro flinch, the sound vibrating through his teeth. Elena moved instinctively to answer it, but Sandro raised a hand. His fingers hovered over the receiver, trembling. With a sharp intake of breath, he lifted it to his ear. Don Sandro? The voice on the other end belonged to Marco, his most trusted enforcer at the docks. In the past, Marco's reports were accepted as gospel, filtered through the secondary medium of paper. But now, Sandro didn't just hear the words, he heard the jagged edges of the man's breathing. He heard the way the O in his name carried a microscopic tremor, a slight hitch in the throat that suggested a tightening of the vocal cords. The shipment from Marseille is secure, Marco continued, his tone forced and overly rhythmic. We moved it to the North Warehouse as planned. No complications, boss. Everything is exactly where it should be. Sandro closed his eyes, leaning into the receiver. The silence he had once cherished was gone, replaced by a hyper-awareness of subtext. Underneath Marco's confident assertion, there was a background hiss, not just of the phone line, but of a nervous swallow, the faint, rhythmic tapping of a finger against a hard surface, and a slight pitchiness in the final syllable of complications. It was a lie. Not a mistake, but a calculated deception. Before the surgery of his silence, Sandro would have nodded and waited for the transcript. Now, he felt the lie like a physical irritant, a sour note in a masterpiece. The gratitude he had felt toward the world moments ago curdled into a cold, sharp-edged realization. His hearing was not just a gift, it was a weapon of interrogation. He had been blind to the nuances of betrayal, protected by a wall of his own making, while his kingdom rotted from within. "Marco," Sandro said, his own voice sounding strange and resonant in his ears. The silence on the other end of the line was deafening. He could hear Marco's heart rate spike, a tiny, frantic thud-thud-thud through the speaker. "You are lying to me," Sandro whispered. The gasp that came back was the most honest thing he had heard in a decade. It was the sound of a man realizing he was no longer talking to a ghost, but to a predator who could finally hear the heartbeat of his prey. The door to the study swung open, and Dr. Vescari entered with the practiced, oily confidence of a man who had long ago mastered the art of managing a powerful patient. He carried his medical bag like a shield, his face set in a mask of professional concern. He did not know that the world had changed, he did not know that the silence he had helped maintain for 10 years had been shattered. "Don Sandro," Vescari began, his voice a smooth, rehearsed baritone. "I heard there was a disturbance. I came as quickly as I could to check the seals. The pressure in the inner ear can be quite temperamental at this altitude." Sandro sat motionless, his back to the door. He didn't turn. Instead, he closed his eyes and listened. He heard the friction of Vescari's expensive wool suit, the frantic, uneven clicking of the doctor's pulse in his neck, and the way his breath caught in the back of his throat, a tiny, wet sound of terror. Vescari wasn't just concerned, he was vibrating with panic. "The seals are gone, doctor," Sandro said. The sound of his own voice sent a fresh ripple of sensation through his skull, but he didn't flinch. He heard Vescari's footsteps stop abruptly. The silence that followed was no longer empty, it was filled with the sound of the doctor's shallow, panicked inhalations. "Gone?" Vescari's voice went up an octave, the pitch straining against the lie. "But that's impossible. Without the corrective dampening, the neurological shock could be fatal. We must replace them immediately." "It's for your protection, Sandro. The world is too loud for a man of your stature." "My protection," Sandro repeated, finally turning the chair. His eyes were cold, fixed on the doctor's sweating brow. "Or yours?" He could hear the truth now. It was in the way Vescari's voice wobbled on the word protection, a hollow, discordant note. The doctor had been the architect of his isolation. He hadn't been curing a condition, he had been maintaining a captive. By keeping Sandro deaf, Vescari and those who paid him had ensured the Don remained a figurehead, a silent idol who couldn't hear the conspiracies whispered in his own hallways. I don't understand," Vescari stammered, his heart now drumming a frantic, guilty rhythm that Sandro could practically feel against his own skin. "I can hear the sweat breaking on your skin, Vescari," Sandro whispered, the rasp of his voice cutting through the room like a blade. "I can hear the lie dying in your throat. Who paid you to keep me in the dark?" Vescari's medical bag slipped from his numb fingers, hitting the rug with a thud that sounded to Sandro like a falling mountain. The doctor collapsed into a chair, his composure disintegrating into a series of jagged, pathetic whimpers. The miracle of sound had become Vescari's executioner. The study felt smaller, the air vibrating with the frequency of Vescari's breakdown. The doctor's hands were splayed across his knees, the fine silk of his trousers damp where his palms pressed down. To Sandro, the sound of the man's rapid, shallow panting was like the rhythmic wheezing of a broken bellows. Every pathetic gasp was an admission. "Speak," Sandro commanded. The word was low, but in the heightened clarity of the room, it carried the resonance of a tolling bell. "It wasn't supposed to be a betrayal," Vescari sobbed, the sound jagged and shrill. "They said it was for the stability of the family. They said a man with your tendencies needed a buffer. A filter." Sandro leaned forward. He could hear the click of Vescari's jaw and the dry, sandpaper friction of the man's tongue against his teeth. "Who are they?" "The council," Vescari whispered, the name barely a breath, yet it thundered in Sandro's ears. "They feared your judgment. When you could hear, you were too sharp, too quick to act. They wanted the silent dawn, the icon they could control, the man who reigned but did not witness. I was paid to tell you the condition was permanent. I was paid to craft the seals that would keep you in a tomb of your own skin." Sandro felt a cold, hollow ache expand in his chest. For 10 years, he had lived in a curated purgatory, believing his body had failed him, while in reality, his closest allies had performed a slow, clinical execution of his senses. He had been a lion in a cage of glass, watched by those who held the key. He heard the doctor's pulse begin to stutter, a rhythmic signature of pure, unadulterated terror. "The money came from a blind account," Vescari continued, his voice breaking into a high-pitched whine. "But the orders came from Marco. He said you were more useful as a myth than a man." "Please, Sandro. I only did what was necessary to keep the peace. The world is a violent place. I gave you silence. I gave you a sanctuary." "You gave me a shroud," Sandro corrected. The sound of his own anger was a low, vibrating hum that seemed to rattle the very floorboards. He stood up, and the simple rustle of his jacket was like the drawing of a sword. Vescari flinched, covering his ears as if he could feel the weight of Sandro's presence through the air itself. Sandro looked at the door, hearing the faint, rhythmic footsteps of the guards in the hall. For the first time, he understood the true geometry of his house. It was a prison built of quiet, and the architect was currently weeping at his feet. The revelation of Vescari's confession hung in the air, but Sandro was no longer listening to the doctor's whimpers. He was listening to the house itself. With his ears now open, the manor felt like a living organism, and for the first time, he could hear the rot in its heartbeat. He moved to his desk, his fingers hovering over a hidden compartment he hadn't touched in years. He withdrew a small, leather-bound ledger, not the one for the family business, but his own private record of debts and lineages. As he flipped the pages, the crisp snap of the paper sounded like a series of small explosions. He was looking for a pattern, a name that connected Marco's dockside betrayals to the council's clinical treason. He thought back to the voices he had heard in the hallways over the past hour, the hushed tones of his guards, the specific cadence of their fear. There was a signature to the conspiracy, a specific elegance to the cruelty that felt familiar. The name crystallized in his mind before he even found it on the page, Niccolò Gravisi. Niccolò was his oldest friend, the man who had sat at his right hand when the silence first began. While Sandro had retreated into his soundless world, Niccolò had become his voice. He had been the one to interpret Sandro's nods, the one to translate the silent Don's intentions to the underworld. In the vacuum of Sandro's hearing, Niccolò had built a throne of his own, constructed entirely of words Sandro could never verify. Sandro leaned back, the leather creaking beneath him. He could hear the distant, melodic chime of a clock downstairs, and beneath it, the low, rhythmic thrum of a car engine idling in the driveway. It was Niccolò's car. He recognized the specific, expensive purr of the custom engine, a sound he had previously categorized only as a vibration in the floorboards. The betrayal was total. Niccolò hadn't just wanted power, he had wanted to keep Sandro alive as a puppet, a ghost king who could be blamed for every atrocity while Niccolò reaped the rewards. Every order for a hit, every forged alliance, every cent stolen from the treasury had been done in Sandro's name, whispered into the ears of men who believed they were serving a silent god. Sandro looked at the phone again. He didn't need to call Marco or the council. He simply waited, listening to the heavy, confident footsteps of Niccolò Gravisi echoing up the grand staircase. Each step was a beat of a drum, a march toward a reckoning. For 10 years, Niccolò had spoken for him. Now, Sandro realized with a cold, predatory focus, it was time for the silent dawn to finally answer back. The predator was no longer blind, and the house began to reveal its secrets in a cacophony of evidence. Sandro did not rush to the door to meet Niccolò. Instead, he moved with the measured grace of a man who had rediscovered his center of gravity. He felt a strange, surging vitality, a reclamation of his own skin. Every sound he heard was a data point, a weapon he began to sharpen in the forge of his mind. He beckoned Elena into the center of the room. He didn't speak, he simply held her gaze. The terror he had felt earlier had solidified into a cold, crystalline resolve. He motioned for her to bring him the various recording devices hidden within the ornate moldings of the library, security measures the council thought were disconnected. With his newly sensitized hearing, he could detect the faint, high-frequency hum of active circuitry behind the wallpaper. They had been recording him, but they had also been recording themselves in the rooms where they thought he was a deaf statue. He sat at the monitor, putting on a pair of high-fidelity headphones. The transition was jarring, the world amplified to a surgical degree. He began to scroll through the digital archives of the past week. He heard the voices of his lieutenants in the foyer, their laughter ringing with the hollow tin of disrespect once they thought they were out of his presence. He heard Niccolò's voice, silkier and more arrogant than he remembered, discussing the transition with a contact in Chicago. "The old man is a husk," Niccolò's recorded voice sneered, the sound vibrating in Sandro's ears with a sickening clarity. "He breathes because I allow it. He rules because I speak. By autumn, we won't even need the body." Sandro didn't flinch. He absorbed the betrayal like a tonic. He began to compile the files, his fingers dancing across the keys with a speed born of decades of repressed action. He gathered bank statements, encrypted messages, and the frantic, whispered conversations of guards who had been bought. Each piece of evidence was a brick in a tomb he was building for Gravisi. He felt the strength returning to his limbs, the lethargy of his silent decade burned away by a righteous, white-hot fury. He was no longer just a man who could hear, he was a man who understood the rhythm of the war to come. He looked at Elena and saw her watching him with a mixture of awe and fear. He reached out, his hand steady as a mountain, and placed a finger to his lips. The silence was no longer a cage. It was a choice. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, bloody shadows across the study, Sandro prepared to give his enemies exactly what they had given him, a world where they would never see the strike coming, because they had forgotten how to listen. The storm finally broke over the estate, the first heavy drops of rain drumming against the slate roof with a percussion that Sandro felt in the very marrow of his bones. He stood by the window, no longer recoiling from the sound, but welcoming it. The thunder was a roar of approval, the wind was a call to arms. For 10 years, he had been a ghost haunting his own halls, a man carved out of marble and muted by treachery. But as he watched the lightning illuminate the dark expanse of his lands, he knew the statue had finally cracked. He looked down at his hands, watching them flex in the low light. They were the hands of a hunter. Niccolò Gravisi hadn't just stolen his hearing, he had stolen a decade of laughter, of music, of the subtle warnings whispered in the dark. He had stolen the ability to hear the truth in a friend's voice and the malice in an enemy's breath. He had turned Sandro into a monument to his own hubris, a silent witness to his own displacement. "He thinks I am still in the dark," Sandro whispered. His voice was no longer a dry rasp, it had found its resonance, a deep, vibrating bass that commanded the air around him. He turned away from the window, his gaze sweeping over the luxury of the room, the velvet curtains, the gold-leafed frames, the priceless rugs. To anyone else, it was an empire. To him, it was a crime scene. Every piece of furniture was a testament to his absence. He reached out and touched the mahogany desk, feeling the grain, but more importantly, hearing the solid, heavy thrum of the wood as his ring tapped against it. He was reborn in a world of vibration and frequency. He could hear the house settling, the distant clatter of silverware in the dining room where the council likely sat, oblivious, toasted to their puppet king. He could hear the gears of the clockwork betrayal grinding to a halt. The hunt would not be loud, not yet. He would move through the shadows of their noise, a predator who understood the silence better than they ever could. He would take back the years, day by day, breath by breath. He would find Nico low, and he would not stop until the man understood the full, terrifying weight of a voice that had been suppressed for 1,000 nights. Sandro walked toward the door, his footsteps firm and rhythmic on the hard floor. He didn't need the plugs. He didn't need the buffer. He wanted to hear every plea, every excuse, and every bone-chilling snap of the life he was about to reclaim. The silent dawn was dead. And in the echoes of the storm, something much more dangerous had taken his place.